They said no one survives a dead world, but no one had met Ethan Cole. The hull groaned like it was breathing its last as crimson warning lights flickered across the command deck, each pulse slower than the one before, like a heartbeat losing rhythm. Outside the viewport, the void shimmered with charged particles, a storm of radiation tearing at the ships, shielding in waves that bent light itself. Commander Lyra Vex stood at the center of it all, her tall blue form perfectly still, gold-lit eyes scanning failing systems as reports stacked faster than her officers could speak. Oxygen reserves dropping, core temperature rising, structural integrity down to 62% and falling. Precision, order, control. That was how her kind survived. And right now, all three were slipping through her fingers. Route auxiliary power to the forward shields, she commanded, voice sharp, measured. No hesitation, no doubt. The crew moved instantly, trained, efficient, superior. All except one. At the far end of the deck, partially obscured by a flickering console, a human stood with grease-stained hands and a toolkit hanging loose at his side. Ethan Cole didn't look like much. Average height, broad shoulders softened by fatigue, brown hair matted slightly with sweat. His uniform wasn't pristine like the others. It was worn, marked by work, by use, by reality. He watched the same failing systems, but his eyes didn't dart between screens. They stayed fixed, calculating, quiet. "Commander," he said, voice low but steady, cutting through the noise not by volume, but by certainty. The shield reroute won't hold. The flux variance is too unstable. You need to shut down the secondary grid before it cascades. A silence followed. Not because they didn't hear him, because they chose not to. Lyra didn't even turn her head. "You will remain at your assigned station, mechanic," she replied, tone cool, final. "Bridge decisions are not your domain." Ethan didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the readings again, then at the subtle tremor in the deck beneath his boots, barely noticeable, but there, growing. He exhaled once. Slow, measured, somewhere deep in the ship. Something shifted, a sound too low for most to catch. But he heard it. Of course he did. His hand tightened slightly around the worn grip of his tool, not in frustration, in readiness. Around him, commands continued, precise and perfect. And wrong. The storm outside intensified, a silent surge pressing against the hull, numbers climbing beyond expected tolerances. Systems blinked, one by one. Lyra's eyes narrowed just a fraction as new warnings stacked over the old ones. Still, she held her posture. Still, she trusted the system. Ethan Cole didn't trust systems. He trusted what they sounded like when they were about to break. And right now, the ship was starting to scream. He took one step forward. Not toward authority, toward the problem. No permission asked. None needed. Because somewhere between the alarms, the silence, and the growing strain in the metal around them, he already knew what came next. The next vibration did not come through the speakers, but through the bones of the ship itself. A deep rolling pressure that traveled under Ethan Cole's boots like distant thunder, and this time even the others felt it as conversations stuttered and hands paused mid-command. The illusion of control cracking just enough for doubt to slip in. Ethan was already moving before the warning appeared, stepping past the boundary line that separated maintenance from command, his eyes scanning not the bright overlays but the dim, ignored corners of the system where failure liked to hide. And when the console beside him flickered to black for half a second, he did not flinch. He just reached down, pulled open the panel, and listened, not with his ears alone, but with the instinct built from too many hours in places where machines failed faster than people could react. Power fluctuation detected in secondary grid. The ship's artificial voice announced, calm and detached, and a cascade of new alerts followed like falling dominoes, each one sharper than the last. While Commander Lyra Vex finally turned her head, her luminous eyes narrowing as the pattern no longer matched her projections. "Stabilize the flow," she ordered, but the response came slower now, hesitation threading through the crew's precision, because the numbers did not make sense anymore, because the system they trusted was beginning to contradict itself. Ethan crouched, fingers moving quickly across exposed circuitry, the heat rising through the deck, plates measurable now. 5 degrees higher than 30 seconds ago, and climbing. The kind of increase that never stopped once it started, and he spoke again, not louder, just closer to the truth. You are feeding instability into a loop. Commander, the more power you push, the faster it breaks. And this time one of the junior officers glanced at him, uncertainty flickering across alien features not used to second-guessing command. But Lyra's voice cut through it, sharper now, edged with something that was not quite anger but close. Return to your station. That is an order. And for a moment, just a moment, Ethan paused, his hand resting on a cable that vibrated like a living thing, his gaze lifting to meet hers across the distance. Not defiant, not submissive, just certain. And then he looked away, not because he accepted the command, but because the ship did not have time for pride. Another tremor hit, stronger, the lights dimming before surging back, and somewhere deep within the vessel a system tripped offline with a hollow, echoing silence that no alarm could mask. And now the crew felt it fully, the shift from controlled failure to something else, something cascading, something inevitable, while Ethan exhaled slowly and pulled the cable free, sparks dancing briefly in the air before dying against the insulated floor, his movements precise, economical, every action measured against seconds that were already running out. Above him, Lyra watched the readouts fracture into contradictions, predictions failing to align, and for the first time since the storm began, she hesitated, just enough for a thought to surface, quiet and unwelcome, that perhaps the one voice she dismissed had not been speaking out of place but ahead of it, and below that thought, deeper still, something even more unfamiliar began to form as she watched the human mechanic work without permission, without recognition, without hesitation, as if survival was not a command to follow but a responsibility he had already accepted long before stepping onto her ship. The deck temperature climbed another 7 degrees in less than a minute, subtle at first, but unmistakable to anyone who had spent time inside a failing system. And Ethan Cole felt it through the thin layer of his boots, the kind of heat that did not come from a single fault, but from too many problems feeding each other at once. While above him the command displays began to desynchronize, data streams lagging by fractions of a second that grew into full delays, turning precise information into dangerous guesswork. And for the first time the crew's movements lost their perfect rhythm as overlapping orders collided in the air. Ethan did not look up. He followed the vibration instead, tracing it along the floor panels to a junction where 3 conduits intersected, each one humming at a slightly different frequency, a detail most would never notice, but to him it was as clear as a warning siren. And he pressed his palm against the metal, eyes closing briefly as if the ship itself was speaking through the contact, translating stress into something he could understand, while the artificial intelligence announced another shift, core regulation delayed, recalibration required, and the words sounded clean, controlled, completely unaware of how close the system was to losing coherence. You are out of time, Ethan said quietly, not directed at anyone, and yet heard by all who were beginning to listen whether they wanted to or not. And one of the officers hesitated before speaking, voice uncertain. Commander, the variance is increasing beyond predicted models. But Lyra Vex did not answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the expanding gap between expectation and reality, a gap she had never encountered at this scale, because her world had always followed rules that could be calculated, contained, and mastered, until now. Ethan moved again, faster, pulling open another access panel and rerouting a manual bypass with movements that ignored protocol but respected necessity, his hands steady despite the rising heat and the shifting deck, and when a spark jumped across the exposed connection, he did not recoil. He adjusted, compensating with the kind of instinct that came from experience no simulation could replicate. And the result was immediate, a brief stabilization ripple through the system, subtle but real, enough to make the nearest console stop flickering for half a second longer than before. Lyra saw it, the anomaly in the failure curve, and her eyes shifted toward him fully this time, not as a distraction, but as a variable she had not accounted for. And in that moment the storm outside surged again, a silent wave pressing against the hull that sent a low resonance through every structure of the ship, deeper now, heavier, like something testing the limits of what could hold. While Ethan straightened slightly, breathing measured, listening again, because the ship was no longer just failing, it was approaching a threshold, and thresholds did not forgive hesitation. If the secondary grid collapses, the feedback will reach the core in under 20 seconds, he said, still not asking permission, simply stating what would happen. And this time the silence that followed was different, no longer dismissal, no longer certainty, but something thinner, something uncertain, as the crew looked not at their commander but at the human who had begun to slow the fall without ever being told to try. And Lyra Vex felt it then, not as fear, but as the first fracture in her absolute control, the realization that the outcome of this moment might depend on someone she had chosen to ignore. And somewhere beneath that realization, quieter than the alarms and steadier than the storm, a new calculation began to form, one that did not rely on hierarchy or design, but on the simple, undeniable fact that the human mechanic was still moving forward while everything else was starting to break. The next alert did not sound like the others. It came in lower, heavier, a sustained tone that lingered in the air as if the ship itself was holding its breath, and the artificial intelligence paused for half a second before speaking again. Secondary grid integrity at critical threshold, cascading failure imminent. And this time no one moved. Immediately, because the meaning was clear even without translation, they had reached the point where systems no longer compensated for error, they amplified it. While Ethan Cole stood in the open panel's glow, watching the readings align in the only pattern that mattered, not the numbers themselves but the direction they were moving, and every line pointed toward the same end. He wiped his hand once against his worn sleeve, not to clean it, but to steady it, and then he reached deeper into the exposed circuitry, adjusting a junction that was never meant to be touched mid-operation, his fingers moving with deliberate precision as if he had already done this before, even though no one on the ship had. "You are bypassing safety protocols," one of the officers said, voice tight, and Ethan did not look up, "because they are about to fail." He replied simply, and the statement carried no defiance, only fact, the kind that did not need approval. Commander Lyra Vex stepped closer now, not fully descending from her position, but no longer distant either, her presence shifting from oversight to observation. And as she watched the human work, she noticed details she had ignored before. The way he did not rush even as time collapsed around them. The way his movements anticipated the system instead of reacting to it. And the way he seemed to listen to something none of her instruments could detect. Another surge rippled through the hull, stronger than the last, and the lights dimmed. Long enough to cast the command deck into a muted gray before stabilizing again. But this time they did not return to full brightness. They hovered just below, like a warning that had decided to stay. Core temperature rising by 3 degrees every 10 seconds. The artificial intelligence reported, and the numbers continued to climb, steady, relentless, while Ethan finally withdrew his hand from the panel and stood, his gaze lifting to the central display where the core schematic pulsed with unstable energy signatures, and for the first time he spoke not to the system, not to himself, but directly to the commander. If the grid collapses now, the feedback loop will not stop at containment, it will reach the core in under 20 seconds, and you will not be able to isolate it. And the room fell silent again. But this silence was different. It carried weight, because everyone understood the implication. Lyra held his gaze, measuring, recalculating, and in that moment the hierarchy that had defined her command began to shift, not outwardly, not yet, but internally, as a new variable replaced an old assumption. And she asked, not as a test, but as a necessity, "What do you propose?" And it was the first time she had addressed him without dismissal, the first time the question carried real intent. Ethan did not hesitate. He turned back to the open panel, already moving. "We isolate the grid manually before it collapses. Cut the feedback path before it reaches the core," he said, his voice steady against the rising hum of failing systems. "But it has to be done from inside the network, not from command." And a flicker of uncertainty crossed the nearest officer's face, because inside meant exposure to everything the ship was trying to contain, while Ethan simply reached for his tool again, tightening his grip as if the decision had already been made long before the question was asked. And as the storm outside pressed harder against the hull, and the numbers continued their steady climb, Commander Lyra Vex realized that control was no longer about issuing perfect commands. It was about choosing who to trust when perfection failed. And for the first time since the crisis began, Her next order did not come from certainty, but from something far rarer, the willingness to follow a human into the unknown. The command did not come with raised volume or dramatic pause. It came quietly, almost seamlessly, yet it shifted the entire weight of the room as Commander Lyra Vex spoke. All non-essential personnel stepped back from the secondary grid, and for the first time her voice aligned with the direction Ethan Cole was already moving, not above him, not against him, but with him. And the subtle change was enough to ripple through the crew as hesitation turned into action, controlled but uncertain, as they cleared space around a system they had been trained never to touch. Manually, the artificial intelligence updated again, its tone unchanged even as the numbers climbed. Grid stability at 12%, projected collapse in 45 seconds, and the countdown settled into the air like a second heartbeat, one that no one could ignore now. While Ethan moved to the central access node, a reinforced panel designed for diagnostics under safe conditions, not for intervention during failure. But he did not slow, his fingers finding the manual release with practiced ease, the seal disengaging with a low hiss that blended into the constant hum of the ship. Heat rolled out from the opening, not intense enough to burn, but strong enough to remind anyone nearby that they were standing too close to something that was never meant to be exposed. And Ethan leaned in, eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the network of conduits and relays, each one carrying a fragment of the system's struggle to hold together, while Lyra stepped closer still, her presence no longer distant command but focused observation, her gaze following his movements not with judgment, but with growing understanding, because she could see now that he was not reacting to the alarms, he was working ahead of them. "You intend to isolate the feedback path manually," she said, not questioning, but confirming, and Ethan nodded once, already reaching deeper into the network. "If we cut it at the wrong point, it accelerates the cascade, so it has to be done before the system tries to compensate again," he replied, his voice steady against the rising tension, and one of the officers shifted uneasily. "There is no guarantee that will work," they said, and Ethan did not look back. "There is no guarantee anything else will," he answered, not dismissing the risk, simply acknowledging it as part of the equation. The ship trembled again, longer this time, the kind of sustained vibration that made the structure feel less like solid metal and more like something under strain, and the lights dimmed another fraction, shadows stretching across the deck as if the ship itself was retreating from its own failure, while the countdown continued. 30 seconds to projected grid collapse, and the number pressed against every decision in the room. Ethan adjusted a relay, then another, his movements precise, economical, never wasted, and with each change a small portion of the system responded, not stabilizing, but shifting, redirecting pressure away from the core, buying seconds that did not exist before, and Lyra saw it clearly now, the pattern emerging from what had looked like chaos, the deliberate reshaping of a failure into something survivable, and in that moment she understood. That control was not about preventing collapse, it was about guiding it. "What do you need?" she asked, and this time there was no distance in her voice, only intent, and Ethan paused just long enough to answer. "Time," he said simply, then added, "and for no one to override what I am about to do." And the request hung in the air, not as defiance, but as necessity, because any interference would break the fragile balance he was building. Lyra turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across her crew, and the next command came without hesitation. "All command overrides are suspended. No system changes without my authorization." And the words landed with authority that no one questioned, even now, especially now, because they could feel the shift just as clearly as she could, the moment where protocol stepped aside for survival. And as the countdown dropped below 20 seconds, and the storm outside pressed harder against the hull, and the system teetered on the edge of irreversible collapse, Ethan Cole reached for the final junction that would determine whether the ship held together or came apart, his hand steady, his focus absolute, as if this moment was not extraordinary at all, but simply another problem that needed to be solved before time ran out. The countdown reached 10 seconds and did not slow, each number falling with mechanical certainty as the artificial intelligence continued its calm report. Grid stability at 6%, cascade threshold approaching. And the words no longer felt like information but inevitability, pressing against the crew with a weight that left no room for hesitation, while Ethan Cole's hand hovered over the final junction, not frozen, not uncertain, but measuring, waiting for the exact moment when the system would be most vulnerable to its own failure. The ship trembled again, longer now, a deep structural resonance that carried through every surface, and the lights dimmed to a low amber glow as non-essential systems shut themselves down in a last attempt to preserve what remained, while Commander Lyra Vex stood just behind him, close enough to see the fine adjustments in his posture, the way his breathing remained steady despite the collapsing environment. And for the first time she understood that his calm was not confidence, it was familiarity, the kind that came from having stood in moments like this before and survived them. 8 seconds, the artificial intelligence stated, and Ethan moved, not fast, not dramatic, but precise, his fingers locking onto the junction and pulling it free with a controlled motion that redirected the energy flow in an instant. And for a fraction of a second nothing happened. The system holding in a suspended state between collapse and recovery, as if deciding which path to take. Then the reaction came, not as an explosion or a surge, but as a shift, a deep internal realignment that traveled through the conduits like a released breath, the violent oscillation in the readings smoothing into something slower, something manageable, while the artificial intelligence paused again, recalculating. Cascade halted, grid instability reduced to 31%, and the number, still dangerous, now carried possibility instead of certainty. Around them, the crew did not speak. They watched, because the difference was undeniable. The ship was no longer accelerating toward failure. It was resisting it, and Ethan did not stop. He adjusted another relay, then another, reinforcing the new balance before the system could revert, his movements as steady as before, as if the most critical moment had already passed in his mind, and what remained was simply completion. Lyra's gaze remained fixed on him, not on the screens, because the screens were finally following him. And that realization settled into her with quiet force, the understanding that control had shifted not through rank or command, but through action, through a single decision made at the right moment without waiting for permission. Core temperature stabilizing. The artificial intelligence added, and the numbers began to fall, slowly at first, then with increasing consistency, each degree a confirmation that the path Ethan had forced the system into was holding, while the storm outside still pressed against the hull, unchanged, relentless, but no longer overwhelming. Ethan finally stepped back from the panel, not in relief, not in triumph, but in assessment, his eyes moving across the displays to confirm what he already knew, that the immediate threat had passed, but the system was still fragile, still dependent on the balance he had created, and he wiped his hand once against his sleeve again. The same simple motion as before, grounding himself in the moment. Silence settled over the command deck, not empty, but full, filled with the weight of what had just happened and what it meant, and in that silence Commander Lyra Vex took one final step forward, standing beside the human she had dismissed, her voice quieter now, stripped of distance and certainty. "You understood the system before it failed," she said, not as praise, but as recognition, and Ethan glanced at her briefly, then back at the ship. "No," he replied, calm as ever. "I just knew how it sounds when it is about to." And the answer lingered, simple, unadorned, carrying a truth that no calculation could replicate, as the ship steadied itself in the storm, held together not by perfection, but by the one person who had never expected it to be. The ship did not return to normal. It settled into something quieter, something cautious, as if even the systems understood that survival had been negotiated rather than secured, and the low hum that replaced the earlier chaos carried a different weight, steady but fragile, while the artificial intelligence adjusted its tone by a fraction, core temperature stabilizing at safe thresholds, grid integrity holding at 42%, and the numbers continued to improve, slowly, deliberately, like a system relearning how to exist without collapsing under its own design. Ethan Cole remained near the open panel, not stepping away, not claiming completion, his attention still anchored to the subtle vibrations running through the structure, because stability was not a moment, it was a process, and processes could reverse if left unattended, while around him the crew began to move again, but differently now, their precision tempered by something new, a quiet awareness that perfection had not saved them. And that thought lingered in every measured action. Commander. Lyra Vex did not return to her elevated position. She stayed where she was, close enough to hear the faint mechanical shifts Ethan seemed to track without effort. And her gaze followed him not with scrutiny, but with consideration, because the pattern had changed, not just in the system, but in her understanding of it. And she spoke again, her voice carrying none of the earlier distance. Your intervention altered the cascade before it reached the core. That was not a calculated maneuver within our operational doctrine. And Ethan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, still focused on the exposed network. Doctrine assumes systems fail in predictable ways, he replied, adjusting a connection by a fraction of an inch. This one did not. And the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any formal explanation, because it acknowledged a truth her command structure had never accounted for. A faint tremor passed through the hull again, weaker this time, but enough to remind them that the storm outside had not changed, and the readings reflected it. Minor fluctuations continuing to ripple through the grid, controlled but persistent, while Ethan straightened slightly, his eyes moving across the displays now that they had regained coherence, confirming that the balance was holding under external pressure. And he stepped back from the panel at last, not in relief, but in completion of a phase, the kind of quiet conclusion that did not announce itself. One of the officers approached cautiously, glancing between Ethan and the stabilized systems, their voice careful. The grid is holding because of the manual isolation, but the architecture was not designed to sustain this configuration long-term, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging what he already knew. It is temporary, he said, long enough to ride out the worst of the storm, not long enough to ignore it. And the statement shifted the room again, from immediate survival to the reality that survival required continuation, not just a single solution. Lyra absorbed that without resistance, her mind already adjusting, recalibrating priorities not around ideal operation but around sustained endurance, and she issued her next command with quiet precision. Begin phased stabilization of all secondary systems under the current configuration, no reversion to standard protocols until further assessment. And the crew responded instantly, not because the command had changed, but because the context had, and they could feel it in the way the system now behaved, guided rather than forced. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze meeting Lyra's for a brief moment, and there was no challenge in it, no expectation. Only a shared understanding that had not existed before, and then he looked away, already considering the next problem, because for him the moment had passed the instant the system began to hold, and what mattered now was what came after, while Lyra remained where she was, watching him step back into the background of the ship he had just kept intact, and for the first time she did not see a mechanic returning to his station. She saw a variable she had failed to measure, one that did not follow rank or design, but something far more difficult to define, something that endured when systems did not. And as the storm continued to press against the hull and the ship held its fragile course through it, that realization settled into her with quiet certainty, changing not the situation, but how she understood it. The storm did not weaken. It shifted, its pressure patterns changing in slow waves that rolled across the hull like a tide that refused to recede. And the ship responded in kind, no longer resisting blindly but adapting, each system holding its place within the fragile configuration Ethan Cole had forced into existence, while the artificial intelligence continued its measured updates. External radiation flux remains elevated, structural integrity holding at 81%, and the numbers carried a strange steadiness now, not safe, but no longer spiraling. Ethan moved along the edge of the command deck, not returning fully to his assigned station, instead stopping at another console where the readings showed minor inconsistencies, the kind most would ignore because they were not critical. But he adjusted them anyway, small corrections that prevented larger ones later. His approach quiet, methodical, as if the crisis had simply narrowed into a series of smaller problems to solve one after another. Commander Lyra Vex observed this without interruption, her posture still, her attention focused not on the storm or the ship, but on the human who continued to move through both with a kind of grounded certainty that no longer felt out of place. And she spoke again, her voice lower, more reflective than before. Your method does not seek perfection, it maintains function. And Ethan glanced at the console, then at her, just briefly. Perfection breaks faster, he replied, returning to the adjustments without emphasis, and the words lingered in the air, not as criticism, but as a quiet redefinition of what survival required. A new alert surfaced, softer than the earlier alarms but persistent. Secondary relay drift detected in Sector 4, and one of the officers began to move toward it, then paused, looking instead to Ethan, not out of uncertainty, but expectation, and Ethan noticed, his expression unchanged. You can correct it, he said, stepping aside just enough. Watch the timing, not just the reading. And the officer hesitated only a second before following the guidance, adjusting the relay with care, and the system responded immediately, stabilizing without further escalation, a small success that carried more weight than its scale suggested. Lyra saw that as well, the transfer of understanding, not through command, but through action and observation. And something shifted again within her, a realization that leadership was not only about directing outcomes, but about recognizing where knowledge already existed, even when it came from unexpected places. The storm pressed harder once more, a final surge that tested every adjustment made since the cascade had been halted, and the ship trembled under the strain. But this time the response was different, not reactive, not chaotic, but controlled. Each system holding its position within the balance Ethan had created, reinforced now by a crew that had begun to understand it. And the artificial intelligence confirmed it moments later. All primary systems maintaining stability, under current configuration. And the words settled into the space with a quiet finality that no longer needed urgency. Ethan stepped back again, his hands still, his attention easing just slightly as the pattern held without intervention, and he looked across the deck, not at the commander, not at the crew, but at the ship itself, as if measuring something beyond the data, something felt rather than calculated. And for a moment he simply stood there, present, grounded, while around him the command deck resumed its rhythm, slower now, more deliberate, shaped by what they had just experienced. Lyra Vex remained where she was, her gaze steady, and when she finally spoke again, it was not to issue an order, but to acknowledge what had changed. Your presence altered more than the system, she said, her tone carrying a quiet clarity, and Ethan did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because the statement did not require one. And after a moment, he simply returned to his work, because for him the shift had never been about recognition. It had been about survival, and survival, once secured, became responsibility again, while the ship moved forward through the storm, not untouched, not untested, but intact, held together by something that had not been part of its original design. The storm began to thin at the edges first, not retreating but loosening its grip, the violent pressure waves stretching farther apart as the ship pushed through the last dense layer of charged particles, and the hull responded with a softer resonance, a sound no longer strained but settling, like metal remembering its shape, while the artificial intelligence delivered its next update with a steadiness that no longer felt artificial. External conditions stabilizing, radiation levels decreasing to tolerable thresholds. And for the first time since the crisis began, the numbers did not demand immediate action, they allowed it. Across the command deck, movement slowed into something deliberate, no longer driven by urgency, but by awareness. Each officer maintaining their station with a precision that now carried understanding behind it, because they had seen what happened when systems were trusted without question, and what it took to hold them together when they failed. While Ethan Cole remained near the edge of the panel he had opened, securing the final connections, not restoring the system to its original state, but reinforcing the configuration that had carried them through, because reverting too quickly would risk undoing everything they had stabilized. Commander Lyra Vex stepped forward once more, her posture composed as always, but no longer distant, her presence now grounded within the same space as the crew she commanded, and as she observed the ship's recovery, she spoke with quiet clarity. Return all systems to monitored operation under current parameters. No automatic reversion until full diagnostics confirm stability. and the order moved through the crew without resistance, not because it was expected, but because it aligned with what they had learned. That control did not always mean restoring what was, but preserving what worked. Ethan finished securing the last junction and stepped back, his hands still, his attention shifting from immediate correction to long-term balance. And he glanced once at the central display, confirming the gradual normalization of core temperature and grid integrity. The slow climb towards safety that would take time, but no longer required urgency. And he turned slightly, as if preparing to return to his assigned station. His role once again reduced in structure if not in reality. Lyra watched. That movement, the quiet transition from critical necessity to background presence, and she spoke again, not as a command, but as a recognition that carried beyond the moment. You acted without directive, against protocol, and altered the outcome of this vessel, she said, her voice steady, measured, but no longer distant, and Ethan paused, just briefly, his gaze shifting toward her, not seeking acknowledgement, only acknowledging the statement itself, and he responded with the same calm simplicity that had defined every action he took. The ship needed it, he said, nothing more, nothing added. And the answer settled into the space between them with a weight that no formal commendation could match. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence no longer filled with tension, but with understanding, and Lyra inclined her head slightly. A gesture small in motion but vast in meaning, not a surrender of authority, but an acknowledgement of something outside it, something she had not measured before. And as Ethan turned away, returning to his work without expectation, without pause, the command deck resumed its steady rhythm around him, guided now not only by systems and structure, but by the quiet awareness that survival had not come from perfection, but from a single human who listened when everything else failed. Beyond the viewport, the stars began to reappear, faint at first, then clearer as the storm released its hold, their light reflecting across the surface of the ship and into the eyes of those who remained. And in that reflection, for just a moment, Commander Lyra Vex did not see a hierarchy or a system, or even a difference between species. She saw something simpler, something more difficult to define. And as the ship moved forward into open space once more, the realization stayed with her, quiet and unspoken, that strength was not always designed. Sometimes it was endured, and that was something her world had never fully understood until now.